I was sitting in my own living room when I first heard my children talk about my funeral, as if I wasn't even there to hear it. Their voices were low, but the words cut deep like cold steel through cloth. Before I say anything else, make sure to subscribe to the channel and drop a comment telling us where you're listening from. It really helps us keep sharing stories like this. I remembered the way Emily, my eldest, spoke that day, not with grief, not with fear of losing her father, but with calculation. "We do it sooner," she said. "We can settle everything before the market turns." She was talking about my life as if it were a stubborn stock she was tired of holding. Now, I'm not a man who shocks easily. I served in the Navy, started a construction business from scratch, and worked through more recessions than most people live to see. But there's a particular kind of pain when you realize your own blood sees you as an obstacle, not a father. That day, I didn't say a word. I sat in my chair, stared at the mantel where Margaret's old picture stood, and let their voices burn into my memory. I was 82 years old, but in that moment, I didn't feel old. I felt awake. It wasn't always like this. Emily and Brian were good kids once. Margaret and I raised them in a small house in Springfield, Missouri, where the summers smelled like cut grass and the winters kept you humble. I taught them to fish on the James River. Margaret taught them to pray before bed, and I taught them the value of earning something with your own two hands. But somewhere along the line, his hands stopped building and started reaching. It began after Margaret passed away. I'd been investing for decades. Real estate, municipal, bonds, a few tech companies before they were household names. Over the years, my portfolio quietly grew to a figure most folks only dream about. I never flaunted it. I drove a 10-year-old Chevy, wore the same leather boots for 20 years, kept my watch set 5 minutes fast so I'd never be late. After her funeral, Emily and Brian started helping me with my accounts. At first, I was grateful. I thought it was just kids looking after their old man, but help slowly turned into control. They'd insist on opening my mail, updating my online banking passwords, and handling my tax returns. Every time I pushed back, Emily would put on that sympathetic tone, the same one she used to use when she wanted more allowance money. "Dad, we're just trying to protect you from making a mistake." The mistake, it turned out, was trusting them blindly. The conversation I overheard in my living room was just the surface of it. That night, long after they left, I went to my study, the one room in the house they rarely bothered with. I pulled out my old steel lockbox from the bottom drawer. It's the one Margaret used to call my stubborn safe, and dug through the folders. I hadn't looked at those papers in months. But when I opened my investment summaries, I noticed small, quiet transfers, 1,000 here, 5,000 there, always for expenses, always signed by one of them. Over the course of 2 years, those expenses added up to almost $400,000. I didn't call them. I didn't shout. I didn't even tell my lawyer yet. I just sat there, the only light coming from the desk lamp, listening to the old house creak in the winter wind. It was in that silence I made my decision. I remembered something Margaret told me once. It's back when I was 35 and losing sleep over a failed bid on a construction project. "Tom," she said, "the best revenge isn't loud. It's the life they never get to touch." Her words stuck to my ribs that night. If my children wanted to plan my funeral early, maybe I'd just skip it. I didn't know exactly how yet, but I knew this. I'd protect what was mine, and I'd do it without giving them the satisfaction of knowing until it was too late. The next morning, I called an old friend, Daniel Harper, my financial advisor from back in the 90s, before the kids got involved. We hadn't spoken in years, but the sound of his steady voice felt like pulling on an old, warm coat. When I told him what was going on, he didn't gasp, didn't scold me for letting it happen. He just said, "Tom, if you trust me, we can fix this, but you're going to have to keep quiet." I've been keeping quiet for a long time, Dan, I said. We met 2 days later at a small diner off Highway 65. The kind with cracked red vinyl booths and coffee so strong it could put hair on a billiard ball. Daniel came in with a briefcase and that calm, deliberate look of his. He spread out the papers between the salt shaker and the sugar jar and began outlining what he called a complete extraction. He explained it in simple terms. I'd liquidate everything I could without triggering alerts, move the funds into a new trust with my name as sole beneficiary, and then disappear. Not vanish like a criminal, but relocate somewhere far, enough away that Emily and Brian would have no legal pull on me. I sipped my coffee, listening to the rain against the diner windows. I imagined the look on Emily's face when she realized the accounts were empty. I imagined Brian pacing in his overpriced kitchen, wondering where all those future plans had gone. I didn't feel guilt, not yet. What I felt was the faint, electric hum of taking back control. When I left that diner, the cold Missouri air bit my cheeks. Daniel shook my hand firmly and said, "Give me a week to set the bones. Then you decide if you want to break them." I drove home slow, the windshield wipers squeaking in rhythm. At a red light, I caught my own reflection in the rearview mirror. An old man, yes, but not defeated. Not by a long shot. That night, Emily called. She wanted to come by to talk about the will. I agreed, and as I hung up, I realized this was going to be the last time they'd ever see me as the man they thought they could bury before his time. The next morning made the coffee stronger than usual. Not because I needed it, but because it gave me something to do with my hands while I waited for Emily. I'd always found that good coffee slowed the mind down just enough to think things through. She arrived 15 minutes late. Lena, expensive beige coat her husband bought her last Christmas. Her perfume reached me before her words did, a sharp, manufactured sweetness. She smiled as she walked in, but it was the kind of smile you give a client, not your father. "Hi, Dad. You look tired," she said, dropping her purse on the table, like she owned the place. I gestured toward the chair opposite me. "Sit down. You said you wanted to talk about the will." She brushed a stray hair behind her ear, crossed her legs, and leaned forward. "Yes, we've been thinking. Just in case something happens, it would be good to have everything clear. Less stress for everyone." I stirred my coffee slowly, letting the spoon click against the mug. "And by we, you mean you and Brian." Her smile flickered, just for a second. "Well, yes, we want to make sure the property, the investments, all of it, is divided fairly." Fairly. I almost laughed. Fair to them, maybe. Not fair to the man who spent 40 years building it. I played along, nodding like I was considering her points. "So, what's your definition of fair?" She didn't hesitate. "Equal split, of course. Brian and I would each get half. K number. Trusts, no restrictions. That way we can both use it how we see fit." I let the silence stretch. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. Inside, I could hear the clock ticking on the mantel. She shifted in her chair, her confidence thinning. "Emily," I said finally, "what makes you think I'm not using it just fine right now?" Her eyes hardened, but her voice stayed soft. "Dad, you're 82. You don't need $8 million. There it was, the first time she'd ever said the number out loud. 8 million. She knew exactly what I had. That was all I needed to hear to confirm what Daniel and I already suspected. She and Brian had been digging through my accounts, probably for years. I finished my coffee, set the mug down, and leaned back. Your mother used to say something funny," she said. "Never count another man's money. It's bad math." Emily forced a laugh, but her eyes flicked to the papers on my desk. "I'm just looking out for you, Dad. We both are. You can't take it with you when you're gone." I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. No, but I can decide exactly where it goes before then. She stayed another 20 minutes, circling the same conversation, never realizing she'd already given me every piece of leverage I needed. By the time she left, Kai knew two things. She and Brian had already agreed on how they'd spend my money. They didn't expect me to last much longer. After she left, Kai locked the front door, sat back down, and dialed Daniel. "They know the number," I said. Daniel didn't waste time. Then we moved fast. "I'm meeting with a private legal team tomorrow. We'll set up the trust under a new entity. You'll be the sole trustee, and the beneficiary will be, well, you." "And when it's done?" I asked. He hesitated. "When it's done, you'll have to make a decision. Stay here and watch them squirm, or disappear and let them wonder." That night, I thought about disappearing. I thought about warm weather, clean streets, and a place where nobody knew my name. I pictured Margaret sitting across from me, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. "They'll take everything if you let them," she would have said, and she'd be right. The next day, I went about my routine like nothing had changed. Morning walk, a stop at the hardware store, lunch at the same little diner. I even called Brian to ask about his kids, pretending I was just a doting granddad. But behind that calm, I was moving pieces. Daniel introduced me to a young lawyer named Sarah Kent. She was sharp, discreet, and had the kind of mind that could dismantle a will in an afternoon if she wanted. She came to my house under the pretense of discussing home insurance policies, so Emily and Brian wouldn't suspect a thing if they drove by. We sat at the kitchen table while she slid papers toward me. "This trust will transfer your assets into a protected account," she explained. "Only you can authorize withdrawals. It's legally airtight." I signed where she pointed. My hand didn't shake once. Later that evening, as the sun dipped, below the trees out back, I got another call from Emily. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Dad, Brian and I have been talking. We think it might be time to downsize the house. Less work for you, more cash flow." I looked around at the living room, the pictures on the walls, the scuffs on the floor from years of kids running through. They weren't thinking about me. They were thinking about the sale price. "I'll think about it," I said, keeping my voice even. But in my mind, the decision was already made. I wasn't going to sell the house to them. I was going to sell it myself, and they'd never see a penny from it. 2 days later, got a thick envelope in the mail from Sarah. Inside were the finalized trust documents, along with a note in her neat handwriting. All said, "You're protected." I placed the papers in my lockbox and closed the lid. Satisfying click of the lock felt like sealing a chapter shut. The next move would be bigger, riskier. I had to start liquidating the investments, the ones my kids thought they'd inherit. That meant closing accounts they knew about, selling properties they'd been eyeing for years, and doing it all under their radar. Daniel had warned me, once you start moving the big money, the clock starts ticking. They'll notice. I nodded. Then let's make sure by the time they do, I'm already gone. The first property I put on the market was the lake house in Branson. Emily loved that place, probably already pictured her own family vacations there. I sold it quietly to a developer from out of state. The sale went through in under a week when the wire hit the new trust account. I felt something I hadn't in months. Control. But that feeling was short-lived, because 2 days later, Emily showed up at my door, unannounced, holding a letter in her hand. Her face was pale, and her voice had an edge to it. "Dad," she said, "we need to talk now." Emily didn't wait for an invitation. She stepped past me into the living room. The letter clutched like it might burn her if she let go. Her heels clicked against the hardwood, sharp and impatient. "Where's the lake house?" she demanded, her voice already too loud for a Wednesday morning. I closed the door slowly, taking my time before answering. "What do you mean?" She turned and waved the letter, a notification from the county clerk's office. "This says You sold it to some developer without telling me or Brian. I kept my voice calm, even gentle. Emily, I didn't realize I had to. Her eyes narrowed. You promised you'd keep the family properties intact. That lake house is where we grew up, where Mom. She stopped herself, realizing too late that the sentimental appeal didn't match the greed in her tone. I walked past her, sat down in my armchair, and motioned for her to do the same. She didn't. Emily, I said, you and Brian have been talking about my assets like they're already yours. That lake house was mine to sell, and I decided to sell it. Her jaw tightened. You're making a mistake. That property was worth more than you think. Brian had plans for it. Ah, there it was. Brian had plans. Not we had memories. Not I wanted to preserve it for the family. Just plans. Brian's plans aren't my concern, I said flatly. She looked at me like I'd slapped her. What is going on with you? First, you won't talk about the will. Now, you're selling off assets. Are you trying to make things harder for us when you're gone? I almost smiled at the choice of words. When you're gone. Not if, not someday, just a matter of time. I leaned forward, folding my hands. Emily, do you know what your mother's last words to me were? She frowned, caught off guard. No, she said, don't let anyone take from you what you worked for. Her lips pressed into a thin line. This isn't about taking. This is about the family's future. Family's future. I chuckled quietly. Or your future. Face flushed, and she turned toward the door. If you're going to start selling everything out from under us, don't expect us to be around much longer. The door slammed behind her before I could reply. That night, I called Daniel. She's rattled, I told him. Good, he said. The more she's off balance, the less she see coming. What's next? I asked. The accounts, he said. We moved the market investments first. Stocks, bonds, liquidate the ones they'd notice on a standard estate report. Then we closed the local accounts and shift everything offshore. Offshore? I asked. He lowered his voice, even though we were on the phone. Discreetly, legally. Once that's done, they can subpoena every bank in Missouri and still come up empty-handed. The next 2 weeks were a blur of signatures, wire transfers, and quiet meetings in small law offices that smelled faintly of old paper and dust. Sarah handled the paperwork with surgical precision, while Daniel coordinated the sales and transfers. Every time a balance dropped in one place, it reappeared somewhere safer places Emily and Brian couldn't find on their best day. During that time, kept my public life exactly the same. I still had breakfast at the diner, still waved to the mailman. I even called Emily once to ask about the kids, making small talk while millions moved invisibly beneath the surface. But every night, when I locked the door and checked the safe, the numbers told me the truth. I was almost free. The last major move was the farm. It wasn't big, but the land was worth a fortune to the right buyer. Developers had been circling it for years. Emily and Brian thought it was their ace in the hole. The unshakable inheritance they'd someday cash in. Daniel found a buyer in under 72 hours. Cash offer, no contingencies. The deal closed in a week. I didn't tell Emily, but she found out. I came home one afternoon to see her car in the driveway. She was sitting on the porch steps, staring at the ground. When she looked up, her face was pale, but her eyes were blazing. You sold the farm, she said. I didn't answer. That was ours, Dad. Ours? No, I said quietly. It was mine, until I decided otherwise. She stood up, her hands shaking. Do you even care what this is doing to the family? I met her eyes. Do you? For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she got into her car and drove away. As I watched her taillights vanish down the road, I realized something. This wasn't just about protecting my money anymore. It was about making sure They never forgot that it was mine to begin with. 3 days later, Daniel handed me a folder. Inside was a single piece of paper, confirmation that every cent I owned was now sitting safely in a private account overseas. "You're officially untouchable," said with a grin. But I wasn't done. Had one more move to make, the one that would make them realize just how wrong they'd been to plan my funeral before. Okay, I was even in the ground, and it started with a plane ticket. The plane ticket wasn't to anywhere exotic, not yet. First, I had to disappear from their radar completely. Daniel helped me pick the location, a small coastal town in Maine. It's a kind that barely showed up on Google Maps. "You can vanish there," he said. "Nobody will ask questions, and you can still move around without being recognized." I booked a one-way flight for the following Tuesday, but before I left Missouri, I had unfinished business. I started with a letter. I wrote it at my kitchen table. It's the same spot where I'd once helped Emily with her algebra homework, and where Brian had eaten too many pancakes on Sunday mornings. I kept my handwriting steady, deliberate, the way my father taught me. It began simply, "Emily, Brian, you should know by now that nothing you have done in the past year has gone unnoticed." I reminded them of the overheard conversation about my funeral, about the lists they'd made of my assets, about the meetings I knew they'd had with real estate agents behind my back. And then I gave them the truth. "You will inherit nothing from me. Not because I don't love you, but because you've stopped seeing me as your father and started seeing me as a checkbook." I told them the money was gone, at least, as far as they were concerned. I'd moved it to a place where no court in Missouri could reach it, but I didn't want to just cut them off. I wanted them to understand the weight of what they'd lost. So, at the end of the letter, I enclosed a photocopy of a bank statement from before the transfers. The number at the bottom, $8,037,412, was circled in red ink. No context, no explanation of where it had gone. It's proof that it existed. The second step of my plan involved the house. I didn't own it anymore. The same week I sold the farm, I had quietly signed it over to a charity that housed veterans in need. It was one of the few moves I hadn't told Daniel about until it was done. By the time Emily and Brian came looking, the house would be filled with people who had no idea who I was and no legal reason to let them in. Daniel drove me to the airport before sunrise. The sky was still dark and the roads were empty. "You sure about this?" B asked. I nodded. "If I stay, they'll find ways to keep circling. Okay, if I go, they're left holding nothing but each other, and I'm not sure that's worth much." He chuckled. "You're colder than I thought." "I'm not cold," I said quietly. "Okay, I'm just done." The flight to Maine was uneventful. I landed mid-morning, picked up a used truck from a local dealer who didn't ask many questions, and drove to a rental cottage near the shore. It was small, just one bedroom, a wood stove, and a view of the Atlantic, but it was mine. That first night, I built a fire, poured myself a glass of bourbon, and listened to the waves. For the first time in years, I felt untouchable. 2 weeks later, the phone rang. I'd kept my old number, just in case. It was Emily. Her voice was tight, almost shaking. "Where are you?" she demanded. "Somewhere quiet," I said. We went to the house. There were strangers there. They said it wasn't yours anymore. "And this letter." She stopped, as if trying to steady herself. "Why would you do this to us?" "To you?" I asked. "Emily, I didn't do this to you. You did this to yourself the moment you stopped being my daughter and started being my heir." There was a long silence. Then she hung up. A few hours later, Brian called. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "That money in the bank statement, where is it?" "Somewhere safe," I said. "It's ours," he snapped. "No, Brian," I replied. "It was mine, and now it's not yours either." He cursed under his breath and hung up. I sat there for a while, staring out at the gray water, listening to the distant cry of gulls. They were angry. They were empty-handed. They had no idea that this was just the beginning, because I hadn't just moved the money out of their reach. I had plans for it, plans that would ensure they'd never see a cent. Even if they spent the rest of their lives looking, and that meant I'd have to go even farther than Maine 2 months in. Maine taught me something I hadn't expected. Peace can feel heavy when it's built on unfinished business. I had cut off Emily and Brian financially. I had taken away their sense of control. But there was still a part of me that wanted to leave something behind. Not for them, but for the right people. I couldn't take the money with me when I was gone, but I could make sure it went exactly where it would hurt them most. Daniel flew out to see me. We sat on the porch in the cold March air, looking over the water. "You ready for the last move?" he asked. I nodded. I've been thinking about it every night. My plan was simple in design, but brutal in impact. I would transfer the $8 million into a trust, not for my children, but for a scholarship fund in my late wife Margaret's name. It would be dedicated to young people from farming families, the kind of kids who knew the value of hard work and the sting of bad harvests. Margaret had always wanted to do something like that. But life and bills and children had gotten in the way. Now, in a strange way, our children's betrayal was making her dream possible. Setting up the trust meant traveling, not just to banks, but to countries where privacy was still respected. Daniel came with me, a friend, an advisor, and, at this point, the only person who knew every detail of what I was doing. We started in Boston, then took a flight to Switzerland. The bank there didn't ask many questions, especially when I handed over the transfer orders. From there, we routed the funds into a secure foundation account in the Cayman Islands. The scholarship program was registered in the States, but the money was sheltered from any legal challenge Emily or Brian might try. The day it was finalized, I felt something inside me loosen. But there was one last step. I wrote them, each one. Final letter short, direct, and unmistakable. Emily, Brian. By now, you've realized the money is not coming back. It's gone into a trust that will help people you've never met and will never meet. Your names are not on it, and they never will be. I hope when you tell this story years from now, you remember that it was your choices, not mine, that decided this ending. I signed it simply. Dad. No address, no phone number. Sent the letters from an airport in Lisbon before boarding my next flight. That was the real departure, not just from Maine, but from the life I'd had. I moved to a quiet coastal town in Portugal, where the pace was slow and the language was soft around the edges. I bought a small stone house with a garden. It's the kind of place Margaret would have loved. I spent my mornings walking the cliffs, my afternoons tending to tomatoes, and my evenings reading on the terrace as the sun slipped into the Atlantic. Every so often, Daniel would send me updates about the scholarship fund. The first year, it paid for 26 students to attend college. The second year, 43. I never met them, but I kept a photo of the group from the first graduating class pinned above my desk. One autumn evening, the sea wind rattled the shutters. Daniel called. "You should know," he said. "Emily and Brian tried to challenge the trust in court. They lost, completely." I smiled, not out of spite, but out of the quiet, settled knowledge that the story was over. They had no claim left, no way back to the life they thought they were entitled to, and I had no regret. I'm an old man now. My hands are slower, my back stiffer, and the mornings colder on my bones. But every time I hear from one of those scholarship students, a letter, a photo, simple thank you, I know I made the right choice. Justice isn't always about punishing the people who hurt you. Sometimes it's about building something beautiful in the space they thought they'd fill with their greed. Margaret would have liked that ending. So do I.